the US government could soon start running out of money. Discussions to raise the debt ceiling were productive, but Washington still doesn't have a deal. So, will the US default on its debt for the very first time? And more importantly, what will that mean for you? First things first, a default would unleash global chaos. If the 2008 financial crisis looked bad, this could be far worse. America's economy would not sink alone. It would take the global economy down with it. No corner of the world will be spared of its effects. If the US doesn't lift the debt ceiling, it'll no longer be able to pay its bills. So, a default would probably tip the US into a recession. If it is breached for even a week, economists say the economy will weaken drastically, wiping out as many as 1.5 million jobs. Any longer than that, and they say the US economic growth would sink. 7.8 million American jobs would vanish. Borrowing rates would jump. Unemployment rates would soar from the current 3.4% to 8%. And the stock market would plunge. But if you're sitting in some other corner of the world, will you still be hit badly? It won't be as bad, but the answer is yes. The US dollar is the reserve currency of the world. That means commodities like oil or wheat are priced in dollars. If the US defaults, the price of the dollar will fall sharply. This means everything will need to be repriced. In economic terms, this is a risk premium. This means things could start getting more expensive. Oil and wheat, and therefore bread prices, could soon go up. A problematic scenario as the cost of living crisis escalates.
The results of this would be catastrophic economically. You'd immediately, the estimates have been that the gross national product might contract over the following 12 months as much as 6 or 7%, that millions of jobs would be lost. And the international monetary system would enter crisis because the dollar and the repayment of dollar-denominated bonds, is the reserve currency for the world. So that even a short default would have permanent negative effects.
A more serious default would cause the US dollar to plummet. That means exchange rates will fluctuate. America's currency is so stable and dependable that merchants in some unstable economies demand payment in dollars instead of their own country's currency. A default would mean some serious trouble for these countries like Sri Lanka, Lebanon, and Ecuador. Now, even when a crisis originates in the US, the dollar is still the go-to haven for investors. This happened in 2008. It's likely to happen now too. But things could take a turn if the default prolongs. The treasury market would likely be paralyzed. Investors might shift money to other places, like US money market funds or the bonds of US corporations. It's a move that would unsettle financial markets across the globe.
Trillions of dollars of US treasuries are held and traded every day. And the result by, this empirical literature is that US taxpayers pay about 25 basis points less in interest when we borrow money than other big countries. If we were to lose that advantage, and we were just to be thought of similarly, the lending to the US government was thought similarly to lending, in euros, lending in yen, that sort of thing, and we were to lose that 25 basis point advantage, that would cost us about $750 billion over the next decade.
US government debt is often the bedrock of the global financial system. As they say, the dollar is king. But this debt default drama has raised questions, both about the enormous financial power of the United States and that of the dollar.
Just as a reminder that Washington, D.C. can teach Hollywood a thing or two about drama, that the parties are constantly battling with one another to get attention from the voters. But in the end, I think that cooler minds will prevail and that we will not fall into a credit crisis or default on our debt.
Email exchanges from inside the BBC, they talk about the risk of violating Indian laws. It's easier to rake up the freedom of speech debate But does it give anyone a free pass to knowingly violate the law? America supports India because it needs India's support in return. And India is working with the US because it suits India's interests. This is how geopolitics works. Last night, he diffused a crisis with his defense minister. But today, Netanyahu was confronted with a new problem. His cabinet seems to have rebelled against him. The UK is looking at the Indian subcontinent to fill its coffers. That India seems to be negotiating from a position of power, like a partner and not a former colony.